So, how does a massive organization even survive when the government itself makes it illegal? Today, we're diving into the story of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, and how it weathered not one, but two complete government bans, coming out completely transformed on the other side.
And this quote, it really nails the theme of what we're talking about. We're not just looking at a series of challenges. We're exploring how these intense crises didn't just test the RSS, but actually fundamentally reshaped its identity and its place in India. These weren't just some political back and forth. No, these were moments that could have ended the organization for good. The first came right after independence, in all that chaos, and the second almost 30 years later, during the really dark days of the emergency.
All right, so let's jump right in. Our story starts back in 1948, just a few months after India became independent. It was a time of incredible hope, but also, deep, violent turmoil.
And wow, when you look at the timeline, everything happened so fast. It all kicked off with the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, which then triggered this immediate, massive government crackdown. The RSS responded with a huge civil disobedience campaign, and eventually things ended with a negotiated compromise.
So, just days later, on February 4th, 1948, the government officially banned the RSS. The official reason given was to root out the forces of hate and violence. The government tried to link the organization's ideology to the environment that led to the assassination, even though the assassin himself had actually left the RSS years before.
And the sheer scale of this crackdown, it was just incredible. Even before the ban was officially announced, the head of the RSS, M.S. Golwalkar, was arrested, and within just a few days, that number swelled to 20,000 volunteers, or Swayamsevaks, who were rounded up and jailed all over the country.
But here's the thing, the members didn't just sit back. They mobilized, they protested, and that number, it just exploded. In the end, something like 80,000 members were put in prison for defying the ban, filling India's jails right to the brim.
So, what do you do in that situation? Well, the RSS came up with this two-part plan. On the one hand, publicly, they launched a massive satyagraha, a really disciplined campaign of non-violent protest. But behind the scenes, something much bigger was happening. The leadership realized that if they didn't have a voice in politics, they'd always be vulnerable. And that experience directly led to the birth of their first political wing, the Bharatiya Jana Sangh.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few decades to 1975, a second ban. But this time was different. It was under a much more sinister backdrop, a nationwide state of emergency, where pretty much all democratic rights were just gone. This test was going to be far, far more brutal.
Just look at these numbers. They're mind-boggling. Of all the political activists who were detained without trial during the emergency, the vast, vast majority were from the RSS. We're talking over 100,000 of its volunteers imprisoned, making the organization the #1 target of the crackdown.
And it wasn't just about being locked up. The conditions inside these prisons were horrific. This quote from our source material is just chilling, and it really captures how severe the treatment was. For a lot of these detainees, it wasn't just imprisonment. It was a period of intense physical abuse and torture.
So what does that actually mean? Well, the reality behind that quote? It's grim. First-hand accounts give us this horrifying list of systematic abuse, from just brutal beatings and electric shocks to medieval stuff like being hung from the ceilings or having their fingernails pulled out. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a deliberate campaign to try and break their spirit.
There's this one story that really stands out, a really vivid example of the brutality people faced. It's the story of the Bullet Batch in Kerala. A group of about 20 young activists staged a simple, non-violent protest. And in response, they were just brutally beaten by the police. The leader's skull was fractured. The rest of them were taken to a secret camp for days of torture, a stark example of the state's unchecked power. Okay, so, with its leaders in jail and all of its activities now illegal, how on earth did the RSS even function, let alone fight back? The answer is pretty incredible: their legendary underground network.
Think about it. How does an organization that's all about local daily meetings just disappear from public view and still operate? It's a huge challenge, right? The answer was in creating a highly disciplined, decentralized structure.
And what they came up with was just genius and incredibly effective. First, they broke the entire organization down into these small four-man cells. That way, if one person got arrested, they couldn't compromise the whole network. Then you had couriers disguised as salesmen or pilgrims carrying coded messages across the country. And, crucially, they ran a secret press, printing and distributing newsletters to get around state censorship and keep that spirit of resistance going.
So you have these two bands, right? But they were totally different animals, and they required completely different responses. In 48, the fight was public, a struggle for legitimacy out in the open. But in 75, it was a secret battle for survival against a dictatorship. And the outcomes were just as different. The first band pushed the RSS into politics, while the second one earned it this unexpected credibility across the political spectrum.
So that brings us to the legacy of all this. What was the long-term impact of surviving these trials, especially that brutal emergency? How did it shape the organization's future? Well, when the emergency finally lifted in 1977, public perception of the RSS had totally changed. Its volunteers, who were once demonized, were now being welcomed as heroes who had stood up to tyranny. And this newfound moral authority, plus their super effective underground network, was widely credited with helping the opposition pull off a historic election victory. And this quote, this one is really something. It's from A.K. Gopalan, a veteran communist leader. I mean, this guy was a total ideological opponent of the RSS. But that shared experience of being in prison, of resisting together, it forged this grudging respect, even from people who completely disagreed with their politics. You know, there's one piece of this puzzle that often gets overlooked, and that's the role of the international media. The Indian press was heavily censored, but outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian, they bypassed that blackout. Their reports on the mass arrests and the torture of political prisoners, including RSS volunteers, showed the whole world what was really happening during the emergency.
So in the end, the story of the RSS bans is a really powerful lesson in how a crisis can forge an identity, how it can totally change a group's political destiny. And it leaves us with this huge question, a question that's just as relevant today as it was then. Where do you draw the line between state security and civil liberties? It's a tension that continues to define democracies all over the world. Thanks for joining me.